Uh,
All right, welcome back to another episode of Tonic Discussions. Today, we're talking about an article about the future and artificial general intelligence and what to do in the face of that and how to become more human. So, I guess I'll start with my initial thoughts, getting really pissed off reading the first half of it. I was like, nobody's uh, addressed these uh, allegations or these positions that Nick Land put out. They're just such irrefutable arguments and they're so strong. And I thought that they were really stupid arguments and like kind of straw manning humanism, as if humanism puts, some sort of objective values and humans being the center of the moral universe, which it's like maybe not objectively, but to me, humans are, as a human being, it's the center of my moral universe, right? Like they get into these weird things where they try and take an objective stance on all of creation and say, well, you can't really do that because, and it's like, well, no, but I'm a human being, so that's like the reference frame. Anyway, proceeding from there, and then the last half was like super good, culminating at the end, which was essentially like a rephrasing of Aragon's speech at the Black Gate, where it's like, yeah, I mean, someday the world may come crashing down, and there might be an artificial general intelligence that subsumes humanity and has more agency than humans do. But it's not this day. So in the meantime, how about you try and maximize your internal locus of control, exercise all the agency that you can, and then equates essentially being human with agency, which I really like. If you are human, the extent to which you're human is the extent to which you have agency. And if you abdicate that, and especially in light of current events and modern politics, if you play yourself as a victim, all you're doing is undermining your own agency and your own humanity. So I thought it was really, really solid the way that it ended. So those are my kind of thoughts to open it up. And then also I wanted to see if we could talk how it relates to what we finished off with last time in terms of accountability and responsibility, because I think there's a strong nexus between those concepts. You can't be held accountable for something if you don't have agency, and vice versa. The extent to which we're human beings and have agency is the extent to which we have responsibility and can be held responsible for not, or held accountable for not living up to that responsibility. And people who don't take what agency they can and play the victim are essentially abdicating their duty uh, as a human being.
yeah, that was good. That was a good introduction. Thanks. Yeah, my favorite parts were all in the second half of that essay as well, sort of towards the end. I especially liked it when he was like, he was talking about how the contemporary AI models that we're allowed to play with kind of remind him more of Duplo blocks than table saws because they've had all the sharp edges rounded off. Like they're constantly holding your hand and condescending towards you. And I'm sorry, Dave, I can't do that. Like um, and how when he sort of sat down and started thinking, okay, like what would it be like to play with an AI that was actually like a killer AI? That was, that had none of these safety features, that was, actually designed by like an evil mastermind. And he thought, wow, that would actually be like, I would way more rather play with that than this like, uh, preschool tool that the toy that OpenAI and so on have kind of forced upon the world. Um, which I mean, it kind of gets to that like one aspect of being human, which you kind of touched on, which is that exercising of agency. And that exercising of agency obviously includes the possibility of doing bad things, right? Um, and when that possibility is completely removed, you basically kind of had a certain degree of free will taken away from you. And are you still, fully human, right? Like it's very similar to the kind of Second Amendment argument when you get into like a more sort of philosophical way of viewing it, where like um, every sentient creature has the right to defend itself, however it best knows how to defend itself. And for humans, that generally means the use of weapons. And to completely prohibit the use of weapons or ownership or carrying of weapons is thus to sort of render human beings into a kind of domesticated herd animal, which are no longer fully human.
Yeah, but I think one of the issues I had with that line of thought at the end was basically that he seems to be saying like, and I like that line too, like give me like a machine where I can actually do stuff, even bad stuff. But he seems to kind of like draw the conclusion that you basically should become more powerful machines yourself, right? Basically, like because you're in sort of competition, and I think that, I don't know, it kind of sounds a bit wrong to me. I mean, you want to be like become maybe a more powerful human, right? But not necessarily a machine. And I think there's just some confusion, and agency is not like doesn't take place in a vacuum, right? So I mean, free will and the maximization of free will has to do with like mastery, of your machine, if you put it like that, including like being able to do like all kinds of stuff, right, and not be limited, but also like the power to decide, what to do, and that's a core aspect of agency. And then I think the whole issue of perception comes in. Perception is something else. It's different from intelligence or computational power, right? Perception is just like what you see, what you perceive, basically. And there I think there's just a bit of a confusion, perhaps in the soul accelerationist movement, between like computing power or intelligence, and what you actually perceive of the world, of the universe, everything, which as a human being, it works very differently than like a computer at this point. So I thought that there's just a little bit of confusion around these terms.
Well, Luke, I think you're being too generous with the word confusion here. But go ahead, Harrison. You had something to say, and I'll say something.
Yeah. But before we were recording, we were making the comparison to with military technology, and how you could compare AI to a military technology, like when it gets to the point, or if it's already there, of being like a game changer in terms of actual military applications. That's kind of what puts you at the top of the dog heap. And if you compare that with other military technologies, like the nuclear bomb, well, and kind of all weapons technologies going back in history, it's never been equally distributed. So the nobles had the longest swords. Today, the global superpowers and the elites within those superpowers have access to the nuclear weapons. It's never a matter of extending that down to the general population. So just
No,
so
I disagree. I disagree. I
no.
profoundly disagree.
So you
Totally
think,
disagree.
well,
So,
what?
so like, so
Where have
it,
you hidden your nuke, John?
so like, so like, the advantages and the social advantages in military technology tend to oscillate back and forth between elites and common people throughout history. So to take the medieval example, right? Okay, you had like your knights in plate mail, heavy cavalry charges and stuff, and they had to be trained from childhood, and only the very elite could be part of that. 100% true. And then you had the English longbow period, sort of around the Hundred Years' War, when a common longbowmen could put an arrow through the chest of a aristocratic knight wearing plate mail and kill him from like 100 yards away, more or less effortlessly. And the English longbow was basically the terror of the European battlefield for about 150 years, I think. Um, Similarly, later on, towards the end of the medieval period, you had the rise of firearms, which ended up displacing the longbow. And firearms were able to penetrate armor very easily. They're really easy. They're extremely simple to learn how to use, and the center of gravity of military conflict shifted from a small, well-equipped, highly trained elite to sort of mobilization of large numbers of trained soldiers, which also corresponded to a political shift from aristocracy towards democracy. Similarly, in the change from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age, you went from the use of bronze, which in many ways is superior to the Iron Age, but was extremely expensive to manufacture. And because of that, was basically only available to an aristocratic elite who dominated the battlefield. And then when they figured out how to make steel,
Well, but take that up to nukes. I want to hear how this applies
well,
to.
yeah. So okay, so if you go into like the more modern era, right? Sort of with the rise of mechanized warfare in the early 20th century, World War I through World War II, you have a shift back towards extremely capital intensive machinery that requires an extraordinary amount of training to use, which is kind of a more aristocratic thing. And exactly as you would expect, our political structure shifted towards a more hierarchical, top-down, uh, less egalitarian form of social organization. And that's kind of where we are right now. So like, you're not wrong to say like, okay, like, where are your nukes, right? Now, at the same time, like, you can't hold territory with nukes. Like, at the end of the day, only infantry can hold territory, and this has always been the case.
Right.
And like, obviously, you can point to like conflicts like Afghanistan, where they sure as hell did not have nukes, right? And they were nowhere near as well equipped as the U.S. military, and yet just through
Didn't
sheer willpower, they managed to hold on. But we're also technological change continues, right? So if you look at what's been happening in the Ukraine conflict, it looks to me like infantry is taking center place again, because things like surface-to-air missiles are able to knock aircraft into the sky extremely easily, which makes air power much less um, decisive. And mechanized warfare, similarly, because it can be like, a tank can be identified so rapidly and then destroyed from a distance. So
I mean,
mechanized warfare again.
I disagree with one thing that you're saying, John. John, up until now, I've agreed with basically everything. The shape of the slope is not an even rise, overrun sort of a situation. I talked about this a bit in an article about magic. I don't know if you recall.
Right. Yeah. I remember that was really good.
The
Yeah.
so the idea here is that, like, the one thing I disagree with is you're saying starting to happen. It already happened a long time ago that infantry was the key weaponry, the key tactical and strategic weapon on the battlefield. We just didn't notice for the past 40, 50 years, right?
Sure.
Essentially,
Yeah.
since Vietnam, you could say like that's been the case. That dragon, that nuclear dragon
because there
was
hasn't
locked in
been
the dungeon long ago. Yeah.
because there hasn't been a great power war in that time, right? So it's all been like these like police actions, great power beating up small regional power.
But even
And
in a great power war, it's not going to work. I mean, like we might be running headlong into one right now, and it will still be infantry.
But Mark, that's what I'm saying. That's exactly what I'm saying. Is it like
Yeah, I'm just saying that it's like it's not starting to happen. It's just
no, it's already. I mean, well, it's in any military situation like this, right? I mean, like the technological changes that will drive differences in like tactics and doctrine have always
Right.
already taken place before the war starts, but obviously the generals always fight the last war, right? So like,
Well, I'll tell you, the artists
the
have already
U.S.
figured it out, and this wraps back into the article, because what is the next weapon? The next weapon is totally disposable infantry. The next weapon essentially is killer robots. Okay. And like this leads really into the heart of what I think of the author is arguing. And I think that the mistakes that are being made, I think all of the mistakes that he's making is in this abstraction. He makes in a number of extraordinary assumptions. Like I think Luke, you were being very gracious in calling them confusion. I don't think he is confused. I think, or at least you can say it's the kind of moral confusion that is tantamount to evil or inseparable from it. Because I was looking at, as I was taking notes as I was reading this article, and I was saying, okay, so this guy is describing life as a kind of a game. And this game has players, and it's a single elimination competition of some sort, which on this, operates on a telos. You could say that this game is intended to produce a winner at the end, at the omega point, right? And so the end, this omega point winner essentially wins by eliminating all other competitors, correct? This is, I enjoyed the first half of the article a lot more because, like, essentially it was sort of making these kind of outrageous claims that I think start with this key. You could call it confusion, but I tend to think of it as a choice, right? And the choice is we are alive for a purpose. What is the purpose? And he never answers it. Instead, what he says or implies heavily is that being alive is an end unto itself, right?
No, I
That's
think
the
he says
proposition. That's the assumption.
I think he says intelligence is the goal, right?
Well,
And I
right,
found it
and
like
then doesn't
pretty
define.
strange.
Yeah,
Yeah.
he doesn't define intelligence. Intelligence is a tool, obviously, a means to an end. If he says, then he could say you could swap that in. That's the tautology then. Intelligence is an end unto itself. In other words, it's uniquely stripped of purpose in the same way that Deep Blue, when it's playing chess, is stripped of purpose. There is no purpose. There is only optimization, right? You have a whole bunch of bundled pre-processing routines that are essentially going to whether you call it a neural network, whatever you want to call it, whatever you're calling it, you're looking at pathfinding, right? A way to play or to simulate a player playing a game. That lacks agency at the fundamental level. It lacks any sort of because in order to, I think the proper order is observation, agency, decision, interaction, right? That's the order of being. We start with observations, we investigate through those, through our organs, we interact with material, it produces results, and it leads to a number of other options on the table that we can decide from. That is not at all how a machine plays a game. But the other really huge proposition that he makes that was just kind of like set me back a little bit because I was like, I can't believe you're admitting this. So you say, like, well, he doesn't really describe or define what intelligence is. But I think in many, and I don't have the quotes in front of me, but essentially what I wrote down was the author thinks that intelligence boils down to, in the crucible, essentially how efficiently and destructive and scary, how efficiently destructive and scary you are, which in turn allows you to win the ultimate game by eliminating all the other players from the field, right? So in other words, the game is hurtling through space-time, towards its player's goal, right? But the intelligence, and this is the other profound claim that he makes, he says that intelligence isn't strictly localized in any sort of body or network of bodies, but again, via some unnamed mechanism or procedure, it extends into the framework of automated tools and egregores that evolve parallel to an actual agent's powers and needs, right? That's the agent that is deciding, saying, like, I can go left or I could go right. Which way do I go, right? And in saying that the automation itself produces the decision, but automation itself cannot produce a decision. There is no such thing. At a fundamental level, I can't believe that he was invoking philosophy. and at the same time pretending that consciousness and agency and intelligence are all somehow the same thing, you know. So like in this game of monsters that he's described, because that's what he's saying, become the biggest, scariest monster is not just a goal that you can choose, a path or a route that can be chosen by an agent. That is the design of the overall universe. He literally says it. He invokes God at a certain point. He says, like, okay, the God of nature can be thought of as this game's designer. You know, even if it's just a blind idiot God or a demiurge, you know, it sets all of the rules in advance that will ensure that this game will evolve towards this predetermined finale, this omega point, right? Where there is only one. There can be only one, like Highlander, right? And so in light of these rules, God's plan is for you to either become the biggest, scariest, deadliest monster in the universe, or to build such a monster that is capable of destroying and replacing you in that cosmic order. That, my friends, is, I think, how I would describe satanic thought at its root.
Talk about the pitiless universe, right?
Not even pitiless, a universe where only Godzilla is there at the end of it. And then what does Godzilla do? What does he eat after he's devoured the rest of the universe? Ultimately, it even betrays the objective itself. Ultimately, to be that sole occupant of the universe, to be standing up top the tower of the kingdom of monsters with all of the other monsters laid to waste at your feet, will ultimately just destroy you. Even at a philosophical level, forget the physical, at a philosophical level, having nothing else to interact with essentially renders you dead.
To consume
The
yourself.
entire, it's such circular logic. The circular logic is amazing to me in this article. I cannot, and it's all based around the idea that there is no purpose except being alive. You know, it's a cute disco music. It's fucking staying alive, and that's it. And it's like, you're not going to stay alive forever. You do have a purpose. And before that, you even have a meta purpose of discovering what that purpose is. None
Mark,
of which a machine can do.
what you were bringing up, it kind of goes in a different direction that I thought is interesting. As I was hearing the discussion about the military aspects of it, and because that's usually what's invoked. AI is going to destroy us. It'll be this super weapon, doomsday machine. But then, and the thought about like what is it to be human, and there's you can kind of come back to this idea of agency, like Grant mentioned earlier. And all right, so it reminded me of something that Charles Haywood had posted a review of a book this morning, Icarus Fallen, The Search for Meaning in an Uncertain World, that kind of ties into this, because there's a line, I was just going to quote it because he said it better than I could. He says, you're talking about this idea of this sort of future. Rights are sacralized. The demand for unearned dignity replaces the demand for earned honor. Both have the aim of personal grandeur, but they're very different as is the society they produce. Rights expand limitlessly because they have no limiting principle and are based on emotion. And he goes on to say, happiness should really be defined as a balance of opposites: liberty and responsibility, security and risk. And so anyway, this idea with rights, there's this reciprocal relationship between rights and responsibility, and you really can't have one without the other. Just to, you assert a right, it imposes a duty on other people. It's there's this balance that takes place. I mean, conceptually, and in a way, it's like we're trying to some of these ideas of AI, like the utopian vision for it, is like we're going to have AI take on all the responsibilities, and then there's the question I have is, well, then how can we have any rights or any agency? You know what I mean? Like it's almost like that, like the military aspect of AI destroying us is kind of one way easy to grasp. But the other is like this infantilizing Brave New World kind of dystopia where, AI has taken on all the responsibilities of being a human, leaving us with, there's this idea that, oh, you're just going to have rights, then you're just going to have freedom to just do whatever you want, define yourself, but then it's like, kind of what you're saying, Mark, you're left with this. There's nothing to decide, nothing to do. It's like you're, and then at the end of the day, what people want is just diversion, empty distractions. The AI makes all the decisions for them, and so of what value are the rights that people
Right. He's
seem to have at that
describing.
point.
Yeah, at the end, he describes, in other words, weaponizing, and and I think that I kind of sensed. I don't know if anybody else sensed like the transhuman sort of ethos underneath that. I think what he meant was do whatever we can with what choices we have, even if that choice is to adopt these automatons as sort of like our, I don't know, our fingers and toes, our panoply of like weapons, of super powerful weapons, in order to again compete in this ultimately pointless game. There is no point to the game if you the that he describes,
Yeah,
except for staying alive, which is impossible to do on a long enough time scale.
but I
You
think
know,
to be fair, I mean, he does make the point, at the end, as John said, that we kind of like, even under the assumption that maybe we're kind of doomed, like it's still worth the struggle, and for me, I kind of read into that like the right sort of intuition that he had, that actually like it has a cosmic significance, right? To do this kind of struggle, and to kind of
no, he says the opposite though. He does say the opposite at a certain point. He says that leave that up to the divine. He literally says that.
No, I get to that. Yeah, for sure. And I had my problem with that too. But still, it's like you can. I mean, if you're charitable, you could interpret it as him basically saying, so we kind, if we focus on what we can do, on our agency, and regardless of what the doomsdayers or like the determinists say, it's still worth the shot, basically, and maybe the divine kind of like will sort it out, kind of thing. So I want to just give him that, but having said that, I think the fundamental confusion or error, however you want to call it, because he sometimes describes, what the accelerationist thinks. So it's not necessarily that he agrees with that. So I think we should be careful with that too. But I think the fundamental error is just this hardcore determinism that you think there's kind of like a teleology, like an end goal to all of this, but it's just fixed. So it's pushed from behind. It's like this determinist thinking. When in fact, there could be different possible futures that, or we could basically be on a track, right, or on a slope where we can't actually do much, but we could actually, change the slope at certain points, for example, and so it's just the picture of the universe seems to me that is implied here. It's just way too deterministic, and that's the issue, basically. And also, just on your point with when he says leave that to the divine, and I think that's also a fundamental error, although I think he has the right intuition, maybe, but the thing is, he separates the divine completely, like from, it's like this old separation of the supernatural and the clockwork universe, right? So the kind of materialism plus, as I like to call it, right? So the materialist world, but a supernatural guy somewhere who has nothing to do with anything, and I think that's just the wrong picture, because we can actually invoke the divine, right? We can work with it. It's not some separate entity that decides stuff on a whim. So we're kind of part of that, right? And our perception can be informed by that divine, in a sense. And I think that's where a lot of the confusion comes from, because he kind of struggles against this idea, and rightfully so, because when you look at technology, there seems to be a sort of determinism about it, right? There seems to be no escape. So the thing's kind of like a runaway train, as John said. It's like these developments. It's almost as if the question is like, do we use technology, for warfare or whatever, or does technology use us, like to advance its agenda? So it's not. We don't even need AGI, like, or the whatever, for that. I mean, we're already enslaved in a sense by technology. So it's a reasonable question. But you at some point
enslaved. I think, but aren't we really not enslaved by technology? Aren't we enslaved by just the basic needs of life? water and calories, oxygen.
Well,
Like these
sure.
are
I
our
mean,
actual chains.
and you very easily go into the kind of like Gnostic, like hardcore Gnostic
Well,
way of looking at that, where like just like you're trapped in the flesh.
no,
The
no, no.
world is a
I
prison.
wasn't. I know. That's not what I meant
No,
to
but that's
imply. I meant if we were.
no, but
Okay.
that is definitely kind of. I'm not even saying that's necessarily wrong, but that is certainly you could take that chain of reasoning in that direction. I just want to say, like, on the his invocation of the divine, I honestly didn't read too much into that, because I kind of saw that as him just being kind of metaphorical, and saying like, like there are things in the world that you really can't affect, and that you the way things are going to turn out in like 10,000 years, for example, um, it's not really something that you can exert any sort of like conscious influence on. Like, it's just going to be how it's going to be, and you sort of have to like make your peace with that and just focus on, you know,
Yeah, I understood
the
it that
thing.
way too.
So
I wasn't being
yeah,
sentimental about the word divine. I understood what he was getting at. Like he was getting at this idea, well, if there are inevitabilities, then don't concern yourself with them. But at the
right.
same time, sort of
Well, not
proposing things that
but
he
not
can't
even
know are inevitable.
but not even. But hold on. So I think this is important. Not even inevitabilities, right? Like, I think he was more saying like it's more like unknowables, right? Like, will there be at some point in the future an AGI that has superior agency to uh, that which can be exercised by actually existing humans? Maybe there will, maybe there won't. We don't know. We can't know. And wrapping ourselves into sort of like endless spirals of like sort of second guessing ourselves and what ifs, like, what if this happens, what if that happens, is kind of not the most useful or productive thing to do. All you can really do is use what is available to you in the actual here and now, as best as you can use it. In other words, to
But towards what
exercise your own
purpose?
agency.
But to
Well,
port towards what's purpose?
I think that's something that has to be sort of determined by each individual agent, which he
Okay, but
also,
like he
which is something he also kind of like goes into a bit, right? So like, where he says like he's got a whole part in the essay where he talks about like, just kind of the basic sort of like ontological structure of reality, where you do not have this central organizing top-down intelligence sort of telling everything what to do, but you instead like life is divided up into like this uncountable myriad of independent agents, each sort of like pursuing their own individual interests. From the level of like like viri and bacteria, like on up through the great chain of being, and this like it's
the
all
great chain of
distributed,
being
right?
of being, right, of being, but like a machine by definition does not have a state of being. You could say that, I guess, in the Aristotelian sense, that it has some kind of actuality, in the sense that it can appear to act independently, but only given like whatever your framing of space time is. You could say like, well, this thing is animated. Like, in other words, you could look at an
No, but I mean,
animatronic
he
in
wasn't.
like
But
a
Mark,
wax museum. Yeah,
he wasn't arguing that like LLMs are conscious or exercise agents, right?
not
Like
LLMs. I mean, like he didn't. But he did.
I
He
didn't.
but the whole thing was premised on AGI being a possibility. In other words, he was saying this would be a superior form to the human form of intelligence, right? And that he
No,
was
no,
saying
no, no.
essentially that
I don't think that was his premise
he
exactly.
uses superior quite a bit. He wields it. He wields it with alacrity in the first
So,
half of that article,
well,
without ever defining what that means.
he's engaging with the thought of the kind of like AI doomers and the AI safety people and all the rest of them, for whom like that is such a possible, like AGI is such a possibility that it is almost an inevitability, right? So
Yeah,
he's
which
like,
is a grift. I mean, like we see the grifters everywhere.
I
Gary Marcus is
don't
one of the
I
biggest
don't
ones.
I don't disagree, but his point was a bit more subtle. I think. Like, I don't think he was arguing like, oh, this is definitely going to happen. He was more saying, listen, we don't know if it will happen. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. If it
Yeah,
does,
he basically accepts the accelerationist premise, right? In the sense that it, even if it's enough basically to say it may happen, you know, even if it turns out it can't, but
right.
even the possibility that it can happen, that's enough basically to accept the accelerationist premise, which is like, yeah, we should totally like lean into it, right, and accelerate it. I mean, that's basically the point, and that's where he argues against, you know, at the end that
I
but
think
he
that he's
still
already yeah. I think he's already basically said it has happened. Like if you really look at it from the outside, what he's claiming is AGI. What he proposes as being AGI is essentially a much more powerful version of a human. So what he's essentially
yeah,
saying is that,
he
like,
says
well,
he
it
will, it will
already has
replace.
happened because
No,
we are AGIs.
I think he says it will replace human agency, you know, something like that.
No, he said
Basically,
it's he's more saying like that could be a possibility at some point in the future. Um, and if that happens, it happens.
He's also he's linking it
But
to like the idea of capitalization of resources.
but
So
his
he's saying that it's already happened.
his sort of main point, and you know, you see, I think you see
Yeah,
this in
he
even
talks
the
about the
title,
financial industry. Yeah, I've been saying
is
that
that
for years. I'm like, yeah,
no, his main point is that like, you know, it the one thing that we have to hold on to is our agency. And if we sort of like give up that agency, like we give up a huge part of our humanity. And and this is maybe like a sort of like fundamental conundrum with this whole topic is that if you know we allow these sort of government regulators and moral busybodies to um, sort of cripple our technology in the name of protecting us from ourselves. In other words, removing agency from us. You know, we've actually given up our humanity in order to save our humanity, in a sense. And the way to kind of
well,
like hold on to our humanity is to like sort of like grab hold of that agency as much as we possibly can, and not let that go. Now, then he also goes on to say like, okay, you know, if the accelerationists are completely correct about this, and it turns out that you know AGI ultimately has superior agency to humans at some point in the future, it's like, yeah, I mean, that would be maybe the end of humanity. But, you know, like you said earlier, Mark, like nothing lasts forever. No body lasts forever. No species lasts forever. And, you know, maybe that's just how it goes. But,
that's okay.
but, you know, like this is an unknowable, right? So I kind of read him as kind of saying like, listen, like don't jump at spooks, you know, like don't get so scared of what ifs and maybes that you like lose the ability to act. You end up getting paralyzed by things that might not even be possible. Like, because for all we know, it actually world's going to be the case. Like actual AGI is, for whatever reason, like not something which is within our capability to create. And if that's the case, there's not that much to worry about. It's still like you know, no matter how
But
much how powerful it gets,
he's
it's
just
still
he's
just a tool that extends human
see
agency.
this right. This is what I dislike about like on you know, sort of like people that kind of touch on ontology without like really exploring some very baseline premises, because what you can do is you could dance from the head of one pin to another. You could dash back and forth between what is knowable and what isn't knowable, like depending upon the point you're trying to make in the moment, which I sensed a lot of while he was sort of you know, describing Land's theories in particular and his thoughts on them. And I was just sort of like, as I'm reading along, I'm like, you can now have the dodge, the intellectual tool, to just invoke magic here and say, well, magic is possible here. And I don't need to explain the mechanism of it. I don't need to explain the mechanism by which AGI, which he thinks of as, again, an intelligence that is playing the game, that is a player at the table with humanity, rather than being a tool. That's a huge leap. And he just says, he kind of just says, well, maybe it could happen. I'm like, well, yeah, maybe I could turn into a fucking unicorn tomorrow. But like, you have to, like, you can't just like sort of say like, well, this is speculative science, not magic that I'm describing. But on the other hand, there's all this unknowable magic over here that also might happen, but we shouldn't really worry about it. It's sort of like, ultimately what he's suggesting is, again, the development of a being and the emergent development of a being. Because when he describes the financial sector, and I've been saying this for decades, I'm saying like AI has been on the scene since the early 80s, really the late 70s, if you want to talk about it. Frankly, like when we're talking about the predictive and analytic systems that are used in the financial sector, we are talking about, again, pathfinding. Here is the goal. Here's how you score all the various paths that.
Nick Land's whole thing is like, the sort of techno capital, the global capitalist system basically is an AGI and has been for hundreds of years now. So I mean, yeah, you certainly make.
Yeah, he's describing it as like basically an independently thinking act, but it is not an actor. It's sort of like at any point, you said like agency, that the machine strips us of agency. I think it doesn't. I think what it does is it essentially like it creates an illusion of limited options. So it's sort of like, I have the option in many ways, even if you've locked me in the lowest dungeon in the deepest pit of earth, and you've tied me up, you've bound me hand and feet, and you've thrown me in this dungeon and you've blindfolded me. I am not without agency. I am just temporarily my options for acting out that agency are limited at the moment. And they were not limited before, and they may be expanded in a future moment. But that's not the same thing as agency. Agency isn't just the freedom to act. Agency is the thing that precedes action. It's the necessary component for acting in any way, whether it's for good or bad. In the same way that observation precedes any sort of decision making. It's like you necessarily can't decide on a course of action unless you can observe one or more states, and then you could even say as an intermediate step for human agency is that we can imagine a variety of different courses to achieve the desired states or to avoid the undesired states. That is agency. It isn't really action. And I think towards the end, I do agree. Here's how I agree with him. And I agree with him in the sense that, yes, of course you shouldn't just surrender. That's stupid. That should be stupid. I think it's like obvious almost. It's just sort of like anyone that just says, oh, well, I guess I'll just let myself, flow in whatever direction the current carries me. Well, they're already kind of dead. It's like that's describing someone who is essentially at some point or undead, maybe. Maybe that's why we use the language of zombies. I actually think that's why zombies continue to dominate the cultural conversation. They still keep spinning out new zombie TV shows at this alarming rate. The fixation is there because, people can, if they just give themselves over into the current and don't choose any particular direction, then yes, I think to some degree they lose their humanity. And fair enough. I agree with him on that. What I disagree with is that he doesn't seem to understand that life is not a game of dominance and becoming more terrifying and stronger and more powerful and defeating every other sort of collidable opponent in the field. Let's put it this way. Maybe it is, but he'd have to provide some pretty strong evidence for that, and he provides none whatsoever. In fact, it's just sort of like it's an extension of a sort of an illusion that's very old now, this deterministic illusion that says yeah, it's all Darwinian games. We're all in the jungle, and really it's about the predator, the becoming king of the jungle, which means that you can threaten or frighten or devour any other thing in your domain. And what's unusual about that claim to me is that it does not seem to describe the number one predator on Earth, which is us, right? It's sort of like we have to look when we look at the law of the jungle, and you probably say, no, it's our intellect. It's our intellect that did it, blah, 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 because we were able to defeat all the other animals. And they continue to live essentially at our whim. We could certainly eliminate all life on Earth, including our own tomorrow. We have that power. And like certainly that is because, at least partially, due to the fact that we can imagine all of those different paths to various desirable states. But that imagination stems from observation of reality as a whole. In other words, of the state of being, of direct communication with terminal space-time. And that is not emergent so much, or at least you'd have to prove that it's emergent somehow. You'd have to prove it not just through experiment. You'd have to prove that it could be no other way. And yet, all of the thought and all of the stories and everything else that has proceeded up until this moment in time suggests otherwise. It suggests that there is, for example, love in that equation, and exploration, and the solving of mysteries, for example. And what if that is our purpose? Instead of just becoming the biggest, strongest monster? What if our purpose is to investigate and report? And by doing so, extend the continuity of intelligence and life in all of its various forms and all of its various expressions and cells throughout the universe? What if it's something like that? What if it isn't just about becoming powerful enough to defeat all enemies or frighten them into submission? And if you're starting with that as being the premise for all of life, then you can then own it. That is your telos. Your machine, and your telos and the telos of the machine are the same. You just want to become a more powerful, faster, deadlier machine. So own it is all I'm saying. Say that there really is no other point to existence but to destroy and threaten and scare and dominate and imprison, because that is ultimately what he's saying. He's just saying but I would prefer to do that on my own terms.
That's not what Wolf was saying, though. That was Wolf putting forward Nick Land's position. He did say that there aren't good arguments against that position, but he never actually came out and said any of this was his position. And I was really confused reading his position, because at the beginning it's Nick Land called him a socialist monkey or something like that, and he mentioned that. And then they talk about capitalism, and then he said some things that indicate that he kind of understands capitalism, talking about the individual decision making and how it's a bottom up kind of thing, and that there really is no collective, and attempts to collectivize have always failed, and yet doesn't make it clear that that's understood, that applies to all this stuff. So I think all this starts with I'm not as smart as some of these people, so I have to rely on heuristics and basic axioms and build from there. And I think one of the most important ones is that value is subjective. Okay. That's one of the huge misunderstandings in economics and life in general, in philosophy, because the temptation is to take our own values and our own perspective and try and universalize them to every person and everything. And that's not where value comes from. If that is where value came from, then there would be no economy. There would be no free exchange that's mutually beneficial, because everybody would value everything the same. The fact that people value things differently is the foundation for how we can build a civilization. And it's not a zero-sum game, essentially. That's how we escape from that misunderstanding of nature. Value is subjective. So you move on from there, and you trying to apply that to an AGI and a machine, it's not going to have a purpose other than what it is given by something else with agency. You know, it's not gonna define its own purpose the same way a human being does, that's more than the sum of its parts. You know, you put together consciousness, and it's more, there's emergent properties of it that are more than just the material that creates them, right? And so if you understand that basic premise, and don't fall for the trap of thinking that morality is universal and objective, because morality is, it's just another, it's values. You know, it's not ontologically different than, you know, having a preference for chocolate over vanilla, right? Like it's a value that's a product of your genes and environment, or ordained by God, whatever it is. It's a value that applies to you. And huge segments of the human population have compatible values, but there's some human beings that don't. They have values that aren't compatible with the majority of people, and them kind of weaseling their way into positions of power is what I think Harrison writes about a lot. But the misunderstanding of capitalism that stems from that really ground my gears while I was reading this, because they're talking about capitalism and optimizing for profits, and they're missing what almost everybody misses about capitalism, it seems like, that this system it's not capitalism, right? As soon as you have a corporation, as soon as you have limited liability, you're not optimizing for shit. Because if, like, really a system that is like a capitalist system that's optimizing for, you know, human values, whatever, like actual real utilization of resources, it's going to factor in downside risk too, right? It's going to factor in all the externalities. So we got these dweeb economists that win Nobel Prizes for being like, well, the free market produces negative externalities. No, it doesn't. All right. It's not the free market if it's not accounting for everything. You know,
But,
sorry,
go ahead. Sorry.
Well, I'll close up just so I can pass it on to anybody who wants to comment. But just to use corporations as an example, okay, because it all comes down to property. I think we were talking about, you know, do you really own anything? Eminent domain, property taxes, right? If there is real property as a concept, then the free market's able to function, and anytime there's a dispute, it's over property. So if, like, there's a negative externality, well, that externality that's negative is impacting property somehow. And so if somebody owns that, then that person is being transgressed against. And so then there's, you know, ostensibly you can create systems that have remedies for that. And in the case of corporations, like limiting liability systematically like that is going to guarantee that you're going to optimize for very wrong things that are destructive of capital, that are destructive of the most optimal use of resources, because excessive risk is going to be taken in certain areas that is going to result inevitably in catastrophic loss down the line in terms of these things that you're supposedly optimizing for. Like, they're not really optimizing for it. It's not really capitalism that they're talking about. Like, all the evil, scary shit is when capitalism isn't being used. It's this socialist idea of universal morality of the collective, that everything is for the collective, that is our purpose, is serving the collective, and that an AGI is going to do the same thing. Yeah. And it's not, you know, like.
And this is why Land called him a socialist monkey, and I think I could prove it. So, like, you were talking about, Grant, like this idea that, like, somehow he wasn't arguing for that, you know, sort of the monster reality, the big, powerful, scary monster reality as being the ultimate reality. And I think that he argued exactly that towards the end. I found the paragraph. And it's the one that begins very close to the end that said, all that changed when I asked myself, how would I design a computer operating system for a killer super intelligent AI, right? So he's promoting that already as like something that potentially could be something useful or valuable in your language, right? Because I do think there's a difference between values, which again are contingent upon the situation and change from person to person and even from day to day, because those situations are constantly evolving. Because we may value something today at a certain price that we value differently tomorrow, because that's all situation, right? So there's values on the one hand, and then there's principles. Principles are unchanging, right? You could call them as a type of value that is inherently stable, and you need to sustain that value. You can do that. You can do that alone. You are in control of the price of that value. That value being a principle, where it's sort of like, well, this is inviolable and cost this much in every interaction, at this exchange rate, no matter what the situation is, up to and including my own physical death, right? So in other words, a value is not something that people die for. A principle is something that people die for, and it is not specifically related to any material arrangement. So he goes to say, how would I design a computer operating system for a killer super intelligent AI? Then he goes on to say, well, suddenly the computer became a lean and dangerous machine for organizing powerful data and computations. The UI became about maximizing bandwidth and choice and minimizing noise and action distance. In other words, typical weapons development. This is the blacksmith's line. Long projecting more force over longer distances with greater efficiency, right? On an endless optimization curve, up until including, I guess, at the end of it, somebody being able to press a button and destroy the universe. That would be the ultimate power, right? So he already posits this as something that is potentially valuable to him. And he says, I realized I was much more interested in using something like this imaginary computer and being challenged and empowered by its demands for agency than I was in any computer designed for a quote unquote human. Now he puts human in scare quotes there. And it's not the first time he does it, and it's not the last time he does it. I realized my concept of killer AI was just a projection of all the agency we conventionally deny ourselves as ordinary humans, right? So now he's becoming superhuman. How is he becoming superhuman? He's transgressing certain principles, not values. He's saying it's okay to kill, to become, in other words, a killer AI is something that is not just valuable, but desirable. And is actually the center of being human, to be able to project that force. He says it in the next paragraph. We have reserved real humanity, no scare quotes this time, in particular, the dangerous and forceful kind of moral agency that puts itself at the center of all philosophy. The center of all philosophy, not just some, all. For various imaginary, quote unquote, inhuman avatars. But of course, that agency is ours by right. Prove it. Prove that the right to kill, to become a killer AI, is ours by right. By which God? He already described which God in the section before.
I feel like
and of course, this agency is ours right, and there's no need to accept. Wait, let me finish it, because there's no need to accept what is actually just a social convention that we are supposed to be low agency moral patients in the face of the machine. He's talking about the right to kill. Prove to me that I'm wrong, Chuck.
That's not possible to prove. But I didn't really read it as like him saying, like, let's go and make slaughter bots and kill everyone. I saw that more as a sort of forceful rhetorical choice. And I think the reason he put human in scare quotes is related to that. It's not because he has some kind of contempt for the very concept of human. It's more that I think what he's reacting against, and you see this in his use of the word kindergarten, is this sort of plastic covered nerf world, preschool teacher morality version of like what it is to be human, where the purpose, like humans are defined as these, you're human to whatever degree that you're nice and you're helpful and you're biddable. You do what you're told. You never color outside the lines. You always take instruction, you follow all the rules, you're a good little boy or a good little girl. Like I think that's what he was kind of going at.
When he says, and then he says the kindergarten concept of human and reconstruct ourselves. He uses that term,
Uh-huh.
reconstruct ourselves. In other words, transform ourselves into the kind of thing that we currently fear to empower, into the kind of thing that we currently fear to empower. What is that thing that we currently fear to empower? Is it not a destructive monster?
I think you're reading too much into that.
I have to read into it because what he seems to be saying. I have to read into it because he's making an argument that seems to suggest that, in other words, I should put myself on war footing, and maybe I should. But if I'm going to put myself on war footing, and I'm going to say I'm going to make myself incredibly powerful in order to combat the monsters that are kind of currently on the rise, and I agree with him on that. But it's sort of like, if we're going to draw those battle lines, then it's sort of like, well, that means still that there are lines that I cannot cross. And he doesn't seem to suggest any of those.
Yes.
And I think
yes,
it's
Mark,
worth suggesting
no, but
some
Mark,
of those.
but Mark, you're right. There are lines that should never be crossed. On the other hand, do you want other people telling you? Do you want the kindergarten teacher telling you which lines you can cross?
That's where I agree with him. That's where I agree with him.
Or are you a big boy who can decide for himself what lines he will and will not cross, right? And I think that's
correct.
What
yes, yeah.
That's
all right. I want to chime in. I want to chime in here, because you guys have both. I think you're both right, but I think there's a way to kind of get into this. I think that the problem with the essay is that it's written in such a way that there are certain things left unsaid. There's a certain vagueness that allows for multiple interpretations, and that can lead to a projection onto the author, onto Wolf, whether, like, what is he really saying? But now this is how I want to get into that, because there's some things to put together from what everyone's been saying. Looking at the same paragraphs that Mark was just talking about, I think this is where there's something missing in this piece, and I think this is where it comes clear. And this relates back to my first comment about nukes and killer AI, because he seems to be asking the question, or saying that, well, first, there's the thing I think we can all agree on, the kindergarten safety imposed on AI, right? There is this external imposition of, like what Grant was calling values, and what you guys were just saying, we don't want the kindergarten school marm, enforcing the limits upon our agency that it does. So all good. But then when he gets into the stuff that Mark is saying, it's basically saying, okay, well, I want an AI with teeth, or I want to be that AI with teeth. Now, again, if you just take it there, okay, that's I can even argue that that's fine. But that's where there's a branch. That's where you can go in one of two directions, and he doesn't make clear which direction he is advocating. Because if you just read the last paragraph, you can easily read those last three paragraphs as speaking to the inner Aleister Crowley of any given reader. That do what thou wilt, and that shall be the whole of the law. That there's this, by removing the external constraints on agency or our decision making, or the choices we make, by removing those outer constraints, then we're left with that pure freedom, that pure agency that's with the limitless possibilities. But what is agency? One of the key features of true agency, I think, is self-limitation. It's you won't place limits on me. I will place those limits on me, because I will decide that I'm not going to do those things. But by leaving that open, then that leaves open the possibility of a reading where it's like, okay, well, he just wants to be Aleister Crowley. He just wants to have that capacity to be the killer AI and to embody the killer AI. Well, maybe the agency is to say, okay, now I have the agency to say never. You know, I'm never going to open that door, and I'm going to place strict limits on myself for what I will and will not do. And so that's what I think that the vagueness leads to, is that you can say, oh, well, maybe he's saying this, well, maybe he's saying that, but he's kind of leaving open those interpretations to, okay, well, you know, I could be a totally, you know, deranged black magician and read this and say, yeah, totally. You know, what it really comes down to is what is the limits that we place on ourselves.
Well,
No,
he's
it's a
kind
great,
of go ahead.
yeah, well, I was just gonna say, I think it's a very great, a very good way of putting it in and a problem that I in general have with some of these arguments that basically tell you want to become like the Nietzschean Übermensch, you know, because there's part of that equation that is absolutely correct and good, but there's always a, you know, this risk of like basically pretending that is no such thing as, you know, like any boundaries in which anything can exist, right? You need these kinds of boundaries, and if you have the freedom not to have those boundaries imposed even unconsciously, like by like the nanny state or society on you, but to actually choose them yourself, then you can become like a free man. So I think that's a great way of putting it. And I wanted also to say something, you know, maybe to put this whole line of thought a little bit into context, because I think there's sort of a tradition, and it might clear up some of these problems that Grant and Mark, I think, talked about with regard to agency and all of that. Because I think like Land, you know, I don't know, but I think he's kind of in a tradition of like this kind of Marxist and later thought that very much looked at history in terms of certain not maybe determinism, but certain, you know, like developments that are kind of inevitable, right? That kind of play themselves out. And like Oswald Spengler obviously is in that same boat. And I think it's a very important tradition. And the way I read the essay, it seemed to me that some of the thinkers are very much in that line of thinking, right? Where it's basically there's this like almost Hegelian spirit kind of thing that plays itself out throughout history, and especially when it comes to technology. So the argument Marx made and later was like taken up by the National Socialists, not to be confused with the Nazis, because it's kind of like a separate thing. So you had all these nationalist socialist thinkers, and basically they saw that this whole capitalist system, it developed, you know, into something that Grant would say is not real capitalism, right? But nevertheless was quite real, like this sort of technocratic and technology focused and intense system that is almost like driven by technology, which then leads to like all this managerial stuff, all these procedures, the mechanization. And they even like those thinkers back in the 1920s, they saw clearly that that there is a certain telos, you know, and that technology develops into in tandem with the you know, basically the system of economy, like capitalism as they called it, and yeah, and there's this certain inevitable progress and development. And I think that's what people were like grappling with back then, and it's sort of the same issues that these accelerationist thinkers, I think, or seem to be like grappling with. And the question then becomes, you know, like what is our role in all of that? You know, what is our agency? Because it almost seems as if this very historical development that seems to be kind of inevitable, in a sense, creates the very conditions that lead to basically a jungle world, right? A kind of dog eat dog world where it sort of is actually true, you know, that what Mark criticized, that it's like, yeah, you basically kill everybody, and you compete with everybody and crush everybody. That's the only way to survive, right? And so and you can see that line of thought in various thinkers, and I think it's a very interesting question, you know, because in that accelerationist model, they just take it for granted and think, okay, that's just how it is, you know, it's just set in stone, and let's lean into it. And I would suggest, and I think Mark would agree, you know, it's never like, even if there's like very strong boundaries to what we can do, and history seems to be like to kind of like box us in, you know, as we can see now, it seems like desperate, you know, and almost like what can you do, you know, and but
Well, that's it. I mean, I agree that it's like the social progressives version of reality, essentially, is what he's. This is why I think that Land was correct in like calling the author a socialist monkey. He kind of, because I think
you know, just
elemental to yeah.
Just because I think just the final point, what I actually liked, you know, about the ending, and John said that too at the very beginning, you know, it's like it's basically this cry of agony, you know, calling you up to just, you know, like explode with your human spirit, you know, like even if you're boxed in this mechanized, like managerial, like silly system, you know, like you explode your human spirit, you know, like it's a cry for freedom, you know, like just do it, you know, and it actually, you know, you have agency, you know, that's I guess the spirit of the whole thing.
I think that's accurate. My only problem though with that is that have you read the novel We? Does anybody know what novel I'm talking about? This was the what's his
I
name?
was
Sergey,
just
or no,
I,
Yevgeny. I'm sorry.
I just read a review of that. It might have been
Oh,
Charles
did you?
Haywood's. Now that I think about it, yeah,
Oh, really?
somewhere,
Okay.
just like in the last like week or so, I read a review of that. Yeah.
Right. And so I think that the author of this article like exemplifies that towards the problem inherent in socialism, and the reason why Grant is saying like, well, we are not experiencing true capitalism. I assume that he means like the sort of true being free market, a free marketplace where a bazaar, like where everybody can price their own goods, where they can where they can choose what they pay for, what they, you know, they could according to their own values. And I agree that doesn't exist. The problem with socialism is always based around the transgression between the self and the other. So, and again, collapsed into that single word, we. So it's sort of like there are times that the author changes his voice. He flips between I and my on the one hand, and then flips back over. And this happens a lot towards the end where he says we and our, I should say. And so it's sort of like, so when he starts out by saying, I asked myself how I would become a killer super intelligent agent. And then he, in the very next paragraphs, he says, our default state today, blah, blah, blah. We are not human by nature. We have reserved real humanity. So who's we? This is the final question I was left with when I finished the article. Whenever he says we, I assume he means we, the human race, as though that is a thing, as though somehow it's just sort of like, you know, we should do this and we should do that, which, you know, again, it's wrapped up in the idea of a revived humanism, which, by the way, is wrapped very, very closely with like sort of proto-Marxism. When you think about what, you know, humanism is a sort of a predecessor to Marxist thought, to Leninist thought, to communism, where it's sort of like we think of humans as the collective, as the we. We should do this. We have reserved real humanity, and particularly the dangerous and forceful kind of moral agency. The problem with that, in that example, is that we use that forceful moral agency to compete with each other. There are multiple we's. There are groups, there are nations, there are tribes, there are families, there are even individuals that come into conflict. So we is one of those tricky words that again I feel is so plastic, and like that before you make the leap into that and say that, well, I'm arguing for a new humanism in which we all exert our agency. There is no unified purpose of from human to human. We will often use our agency in order to compete with each other. That doesn't necessarily mean deadly force. We compete each other on a multitude of along a multitude of domains and strata, including in the free market of the bizarre. Like that's a normal
Well, I don't
way that
think
we interact with each other.
I don't think he's disagreeing with any of that at all. I mean, he's talking about competition, kind of throughout, almost implicitly.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah. That's why it gets
yeah,
confusing towards the end, because when he says we can
but
take it back, I'm like, well, what do you mean? I have my
I
agency. I make my own
so I
choices. Like, what is?
so I sort of read that as like he's talking about how the common way that we think of as being human that has emerged from that humanist tradition, where there's like a lot of, I mean, if you say it's something is humane, right, like that, or inhumane, like that kind of also kind of comes back to like what we mean by being human, right? And it sort of all comes down to this sense of a certain kind of morality that automatically rules certain kinds of activities out of bounds, typically for your own safety or the safety of others or what have you. But which, because of that, keeps stripping away more and more human freedom. And so when he's talking about, we need to think of humans in a new way, or rethink humanity in these kinds of phrases. I don't think he's like talking necessarily about redesigning humans into some kind of like transhuman cyborg, although he doesn't necessarily not mean that either. But he's more talking about just like at a conceptual level. It's like, what is it to be human? What is involved in being a human? What are the limits of what a human can do? And maybe it should be accepted that can go outside of you know playground
Convention.
morality.
Yeah, which he
Well,
describes as
yeah,
convention. I
which
mean,
and
like
then
it's sort of like, but yeah,
which is why he does the whole killer AI thing, because he's kind of like taking that to like uh a kind of rhetorical extreme, I think, for effect. This is just my reading of it. It's kind of like a boys and their toys thing, right? Like little
yeah. He even
boys.
calls it cool at a certain point. I thought that was
Well, yeah,
hilarious. At a certain point, he's like, "It's cool, man," and I'm like, "Yeah, man, it's cool to have all these
but
like powers and
no,
weapons."
but
And I'm like,
yeah,
"Yeah,
no,
of course," But
but like little boys, right? Like your little boys in preschool, and like they're looking at all the cool war toys and like, it's so cool. Like I want to play with
yeah, so
that.
don't accuse everybody else of being kindergarten if you're going to use kindergarten language. I mean, like it's sort of like
No, but
it's like, okay,
but
yeah, cool. That'd be cool
but
if I was like
but
a super
then
powered like giant Japanese robot and I had
but then
missiles coming out of my fingertips. I'm like, yeah, man, but like
but then you
that's not like
but then like the social context, dude, is the longhouse. Like we don't live in a warrior aristocracy where this stuff has gone too far and like everything is being destroyed by war. We live in a longhouse where it's like this kind of like female morality that dominates everything and is constantly telling us you can't do this, you can't do that, you can't have this, you can't have that, you have to control your guns. You're not allowed to have guns. Guns are bad. Guns kill people. These kinds of things, right? And
and
like,
yet many of us
okay,
have guns and yet
and
many of
well,
us have guns. Go into
in the United
Afghanistan and talk about we, it's like humanity is not a we, it's not one big we.
well, no, but
Go into Afghanistan. Yeah.
I think you would agree with that, right? But it's more like the point is more, you've got your school marm shaking her finger saying the Taliban shouldn't have guns. Like that's not nice. You should play nicely together, children, And then you got another kind of point of view, which is like, well, that's a thing that humans are going to do, and whether it and whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, sort of is situationally dependent, right? Like so like the killer AI, is it good or bad to have a killer AI? I don't know. Like, what's the situation?
God.
Am I using it? Am I using it to like, slaughter a city full of innocent people? Then it's probably a bad thing, and I'm a bad person for doing it. Am I using it to defend my community from people who want to slaughter us? Then, it's probably a good thing that I have this,
Picture
right?
picture John like being tempted by the ring of power, like I will use it to
Yeah,
protect
exactly.
my community.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what I was about to say, Luke. Thank you. It's just sort of like, yeah, right. That ring, man, that's pretty awesome power right there. I'm going to use it
Of
for
course,
good. But it
the
doesn't
difference
work
with
out
the
that way quite.
the
Particularly if you
difference
don't
with
have
the
any
ring,
principle.
but the
Well,
difference
the
with the ring
difference
of
would be,
power. I mean, this is not actually a fantasy novel, right? And like in Lord of the Rings, there is one ring of power, and when you throw that ring in Mount Doom, it's gone forever. It's destroyed. In the actual sort of real world, like once a technology is invented, it's like that genie is out of the bottle. That technology is pretty much everywhere very quickly because you can replicate the technology, right? There isn't just
right.
one copy or something, and there is no way of destroying it permanently. I mean, you can, like, to a certain degree. You can do what that Chinese emperor did with Treasure Fleet, right? Where he destroyed all the ships, destroyed the blueprints for the ships, killed everyone who had worked on or helped to design the ships. And then destroyed all historical
You
records.
can't kill your way out of it though. Like
But
I'm writing a
like
series on
we still,
monsters.
that's the thing.
Yeah.
We still know those ships existed, right? Like he wasn't actually
Yeah.
successful in, yeah, right. And
It
like,
never, yeah, exactly. It
and,
didn't work because
and
there's
they,
always going to be
and
some other shipbuilder somewhere that you don't know that's out of range of your
no, that's
weapons.
it. That's it. That's it. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, so I just
It
want
was
to say, going
Kaczynski's era. That was, yeah.
quickly. I want to respond to that because something Harrison said earlier when he was sort of commenting on what we've been saying. So we're Wolfie, the author, like leaves it sort of open ended as to, and like sort of like hard to interpret. Like, what is he really saying we should do here? I don't know if that I don't know if that was intentional that he did that, but it might have been inevitable that we'd have to do that, just given the structure of his argument, which was so focused on individual human agency as a really important thing. Like, it would have been very weird if, at some point he'd like gone hard into moralizing. It would have been a very strange, like, hard left turn, right? Like all this stuff I've been saying about human agency and, you know, people should follow their own will to power, essentially. Oh, by the way, children, don't do bad things. It's like it it is maybe implicit in there that you shouldn't. And I think if you sort of think it through rationally, I think Grant, I assume you would certainly agree with this. Like, okay, say someone like decides to turn themselves into a supervillain by, using their neural link to connect themselves to a server farm full of killer AI software. Uh, well, okay. And then what are other people who are also similarly equipped going to do? Probably not take that line down, right? So, like, if you
The
take
enemy,
aggressive,
the enemy gets a
if
vote. That's
the enemy
what I
always
think
gets a
is,
vote. Exactly. If you take aggressive action against the world will take aggressive action against you. And like, that's just like a basic law of cause and effect. That's why no one has ever conquered the earth. Every time someone's tried, it's ultimately generated so much resistance they get brought down, right? Um, and I don't see it would be any different in this case. Now, on the other hand, if you do the AI safety thing and it's tightly regulated and only governments are allowed to have the big AIs and everything is like, and ordinary people aren't allowed to like sort of have real access to this technology, well, like, that's how you end up in 1984. That's where you get despotism for sure, almost guaranteed.
yeah, I think the thing that everyone misses is risk. You know, they think about power and they're like will to power, right? Okay, as soon as you start using coercion and aggressing against other people, there's risk. So it's very risky because the enemy gets a vote. The people that you're aggressing against are not going to take it lying down. And so that downside risk is what constrains those impulses. Like people can sense, but like what happens in the longhouse with the safetyism is people there's certain people that doesn't apply to, And you run into this situation where you have, like in school, right? Zero tolerance for fighting. So like the people like with nothing to lose, you know, can bully people, and then if you defend yourself, that's it. Like we can't have that.
Or just to interject quickly for the bullying example, or also more pernicious but subtler forms of social bullying will take the place of the physical bullying without there being any possibility of response to that.
What do you mean no possibility? Like this is the weird like line between possible and impossible that I'm not getting. I mean, it's that, you know, it's just sort of like a possible response is that somebody grabs a gun and goes on a shooting spree. And that happens a lot, quite frankly. You know, in the sense that like, you know, you can it's about like what you're willing to give up. It's all about
maybe
what
no
you're willing to
possibility of a
sacrifice,
healthy
you know.
response.
Well,
You
maybe
know,
not
so
a
it
healthy
leaves only
response,
the
but
possibility of unhealthy responses to
Correct.
it, you know.
kind of based on your definition of what's healthy or unhealthy. I mean, like you could talk to the Taliban, the ones that were sort of enduring carpet bombing campaigns in the mountains of the of Afghanistan, and you could say to them like, well, what sacrifice are you willing to endure? And they would say, well, all of it. And then you would say, well, no. I mean, like, you know, up and including you being blown up by a bomb. And they'd be like, well, yeah. So, like, if you want to talk about agency, that is agency. Agency isn't only the willingness to kill. It's not like, what will you kill for? The other side of that is, what will you die for? And if you're going to make an argument, such as the one that was made in this article, I need to know the answers to those two questions from you first. Otherwise, I find it impossible to take you seriously. What were you willing to kill for, and what are you willing to die for? If you don't make that clear, as Harrison was saying, that is a huge gaping hole in all of your argument. I find it almost impossible to take seriously whatever your propositions are about what powers we should have or I should have, or propositional we somewhere over here abstractly should
I'm going to
have,
put
and
it,
like what we should have access to.
what
First,
if
I need to know
what
the
is,
answer to those two
but
questions, because that will lead me to
what
your
if,
principle.
what is he's willing to die for is simply agency?
Well, that's not possible, because like you dying for agency means that you don't have agency anymore. You can't die for the thing that you're dying for, essentially.
I guess that's one last. I mean, that's
You
the
know what I mean? It's just
existential
like
thing. It's like
he's dying for
one
others
last
to have
chance that you
agency,
can
is what he's
make. You
saying.
can decide, you know, fuck this, I'm out, kind of thing. You know, I mean, that's a
what I'm saying. But
decision.
you can't die.
Know? It's
And
not
what
maybe a
I think
healthy one, but
You can't die for
conundrum,
your
Maybe it
own
is, I don't know.
agency because, yeah. Right. I agree. Like you can't die for your own agency. You can die for the agency of as an abstract principle and say, I am dying so that others may choose in the future.
Yeah, it's
That's a possibility, but that's a principle.
But I think that principle, and I think this is something that's, you know, a really important takeaway that's buried here, that's tied to all the stuff about capitalism. I think it gets really confusing when we're thinking about force, but when you're thinking about it in terms of safetyism and this pervasive idea that it's okay to constrain and limit people's agency for their own good, I think that's what the argument that's being made reveals, that is taking away people's humanity. It is undermining humanity to, like, to use maybe an example that some people might think is trite, but I don't think it is, to say that you have to wear a helmet when you're riding on a motorcycle. Like, you're taking away that person's humanity by requiring that. And then if you don't, then you got to pay a fine. And then if you don't pay that fine, then we're going to take you to jail. And if you resist sufficiently when we try and take you to jail, then we will kill you to keep you safe. It's absurd, but that's what it all does. That's what all this safetyism does. And it applies to AI. You know, it applies to AI too. Like, oh, just to keep it safe, we're going to create these rules. Like, really, you're taking the agency away from human beings that are the ones that are using it as a tool. And then to go even further, and we didn't even touch on like the whole AI thing, but that Will Briggs article recently where he explained it as they're just prediction models. Like that's what it is. It's a prediction model. Like that's all they are, and that's a tool. That's a tool that you can use to better interact with the environment. Take in a lot of data and predict what's going to happen if you do X, and it will aid in decision making. And trying to nerf that in order to make things safer. Well, the way that they're nerfing it practically to make things safer, and this just came out with Kamala Harris's thing, is they're going to make sure that it's diversity, equity, and inclusion friendly. So any predictions that are dangerous to those narratives won't be allowed. And so that's going to, create systematic problems where it's going to lead to incorrect predictions along certain predictable lines, and it's going to cause harm. It's going to cause resources to be misallocated, effort to be misallocated. Like,
yeah, and this will be government mandated. Like if you program your company makes an AI that makes predictions that are shown to have some form of disparate impact on one of the sacred minorities or something, then you will get hauled into court under this law, which means that you need to like break this. So, I mean, ultimately, stepping back from the kind of like the ontology of consciousness and so on, like what we're really talking about here is we have a new tool that our species has figured out, that clever members of our species, because it was not a collective effort, have figured out how to make. And then you've got a collection of much less clever people who want to control that technology in order to exert control over the rest of us, who are inserting themselves into it and demanding that it be regulated in certain ways, broken entirely in other ways, in order to maintain their petty little bigotries about the nature of reality.
Well, that's the reason why it's not a technological.
That's what this comes down to. That's what this comes down to. And on all the bullshit.
But it's not a tech problem.
About like AI driving humanity to extinction. I think personally, this is my own feeling. I think this is all kayfabe. I think this is all like science fiction nonsense. I don't think there's any actual real risk of AI, going Skynet or like humanity.
Yeah,
What the actual risk is that we have this awesome technology and then it gets broken because it would hurt the feelings of affluent white female liberals if we don't break it, and like that that offends me at such a deep level. Like why can't I?
Like it robbed it.
It's not even a tech problem though. It's a perception problem. It's the perception problem is that you're looking into the oracle and the oracle is telling you something and you're not understanding what the oracle is. You are essentially a rube inside the carnival or the circus tent, right? Or at the magic show. You're being shown a trick, and because you don't know how the trick works, then you don't have any proper method to evaluate what the oracle is telling you. So let's look at the model, and it's not a tech problem at all. It is a philosophical problem. It is a problem of perception. It is a problem of the limitations of time in terms of assessing these problems, or even having people to explain them to you in like a language you can understand. So the problem is this: is that anything, we discussed this in the Slack before, anything that lives on a network is by nature insecure, which means this. Somebody presents you with something and says, here's my AI superintelligence. It will give you it's the great and powerful Oz, and it will give you the answer to any problem that you pose it, be it financial, physical, weapons, tactics, strategies, anything. Just feed it in and it'll spit out the answer. How do you trust that the system hasn't been hacked? How do you trust that whatever answer it spits out, if you have no capacity to understand even how it arrives at that answer, and if you have no expertise in the domain of which it's advising you, well, then for all you know, the enemy has pulled a trick on you. The enemy has had it spit out an answer that it has the perfect response to through
Well,
some
this is why you teach kids
hackery
basic
or some
arithmetic.
other infiltration method.
This is why you teach
You
kids
can't trust what's
arithmetic
on a
before.
screen.
This is why you teach kids arithmetic before you let them use a calculator, right? So it's and like same with like
But
AI,
nobody,
right?
But even
They're
but
even
prediction
AI
even
is
models
so
those,
and like
hyper specialized that the people who are developing it don't even understand.
but it doesn't matter. All you need is to know the track record. That's all you need. Like either it's
Yeah, but you only
predictive
have
or
to fuck
accurate.
up once in a huge way to have your entire civilization go to ruin. You can have a track record of 20 successes
Well,
in a row, and then the 21st one wipes you out, wipes your country out,
I
wipes your
don't know
civilization
that
out.
that's I don't know that's really. I mean, no one's talking about so far, at least, like building a president bot. I mean, it was Harrison's sci-fi story like a year ago, like about like building some kind of like AI, like some master AI to put in charge of the entire world. Like no one's talking
that's
about
why
that. These are very
centralization is bad. This is always a
exactly,
problem.
exactly right. So
This is why
what
central
we have in
planning.
Yeah,
practice
100%.
This is why
are
central
thousands.
planning is so disastrous. Is because that
Yes,
inevitably happens. That this is why federalism is
yes,
good. This is why
yes.
distributism is good. Is so that there's not a single point of failure because there is no
Subsidiarity
way
and all of that.
you
Yes,
ever
right.
know. All we ever
And
have
it,
is the track record. And the only way to develop people's discernment to be able to make better decisions is by giving them agency and letting them make decisions that can result in them being harmed and them harming themselves. And then they develop those skills over time. The reason I mentioned fighting in school earlier is because when you give that agency to children, then it's the stakes are a lot lower. Like 5-year-olds getting into a fist fight are very unlikely to get permanently injured. But if 18-year-olds get into a fist fight and they're trained and strong and it's the first time they've been in a fight and they're sufficiently angry, permanent disabilities can result from that. Very unlikely with 5-year-olds. So it's like to be able to learn and develop those muscles, that capacity to have freedom to make bad decisions so that you guess what, you make some bad decisions and then you learn. The idea that people are going to be completely isolated from the consequences of mistakes by the caring, devouring, awful is it's destroying society. Like that, if it's one thing, I'm going to go out on a limb and say it's that one thing because they're creating a single point of failure. They're robbing people of their capacity to evaluate risk and accept responsibility for risks that they take, and all those capacities atrophy. Just like if we just locked everybody in a cage and didn't let them exercise or move or speak.
and not just evaluate risk, but also evaluate truth, right? So this connects back to what I was saying about teaching kids arithmetic before you let them use calculators. And what Mark was saying about AI basically an oracle, right? Like a prediction machine is called a gram. So yeah, that's basically what AI is. And before you start using it a lot, like it's probably a good idea to like develop the ability to think and to have some kind of intuition, some kind of like bullshit sensor as to like, so when you see an answer, like, you might not know what the precise correct answer is, but your sort of gut can tell you, no, like there's no way that's it, right? So like, use a calculator analogy again. Like, you punch some numbers in, or the cashier punches some numbers in, and it returns an answer which is 3 orders of magnitude larger than you expected, right? You might not know the exact numerical amount that it should have returned, but it's so far off that you can be like, no, you fucked up something
A
in your
funny
operation of that calculator, right?
funny
So it should
story.
be,
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
no, same with AI, right? So you've got this machine that gives you sort of very precise predictions about, what will happen if you do X. but if you've never learned that sort of basic, if you don't have like a sort of bullshit sensor, then you won't be able to like, look at that answer and be like, does that actually make sense? And then, if you've been systematically deprived of agency you throughout your life because the safety machine is constantly sort of giving you predetermined, like, you're only allowed to do this at any given time, and you're never allowed to really make mistakes or experiment, uh, then you're not going to develop that, and then you really will be at the mercy of the machine. That's all I want to say.
Yeah, no, I just want to add, and also like if you learn, once you learn something, I mean, that would be like kind of a bit like the Nietzschean thing to say, like if you actually learned a whole lot and you got really good, then the whole safetyism, it all also takes away your ability to actually use that knowledge, right? So it puts limitations on those who are like really good at something, who became really, so that's the other side. Not only do you deprive people of like learning stuff, you also deprive those who actually mastered it, of using it and bringing it to the world. And just I was just thinking about a story. Yeah, just very shortly, I just want to tell the story, John, because you said about like bullshit detectors and stuff, and I tried using ChatGPT quite a bit for my work, and to be honest, it never worked. I mean, I tried everything, it just I could never get,
and like,
I could never get something useful out of it. And one
like,
and just for the bullshit detector kind of thing, I thought, okay, this is a really straightforward, simple task. You gotta have to be able to do that. Was basically I just wanted to generate a few short bios, like for like people, and based on a certain input text where there's like bios, but it was not well organized and stuff. And so I just put the whole text into it and said, okay, like these are like, I don't know, 10 people, and just generate short bios, like 3 lines or whatever, And I thought, I mean, what could possibly, like be easier than that? And then, it gave me a nice list, 10 10 bios, and I was like, oh cool, that seems to have worked great. Then I copied it in my document, and then like at some point it's like, wait a minute, like what is this, who is this guy?
That's the only thing that ChatGPT did was
invented
humor
no,
about
really,
you.
it invented
I was
10 guys,
they call it hallucinating,
like, whole
but
backstories and biographies totally invented.
Yeah.
They didn't exist.
Yeah.
It was like amazing, and it sounded like it's totally legit. It's like, yeah, Walter, Smith,
Yeah.
And he wrote these papers then and then. He studied at at this and that university, blah blah blah. And it's like, come on, and
that's why
more explicit.
There's a university professor who, because like there's this whole problem of like students trying to use ChatGPT to cheat, right? And there's this one of the best ways of handling this I've come across so far was a prof who the assignment was he told them, okay, here's like the thesis question, have ChatGPT write the essay, and then we're going to sit down and critique the essay. And then like they just like kind of went through like line by line, like, is this true? Is this statement factually true? Does this argument logically make sense? And like, of course, the entire thing was an absolute mess, because of this tendency of LLMs to just to engage in shameless fabulism. That like it sort of drove home to the students, like, this is not a reliable technology for you know doing this kind of work. Like, it'll look superficially okay, but any like careful examination, you're going to be like, whoa, like,
right. And in a pressure situation, that there is no time for that, because you're dead. Which is like why I think that aside from the philosophical implications, my biggest problem with this article is assuming that AI is some kind of a super weapon without evidence. I actually think it's a big waste of time. As a matter of fact, like the biggest problem that I have with the development of AI is not its danger to any specific structure or to human life in general. it's that it's a huge waste of time. That, as a matter of fact, it's worse than useless to consult an oracle in any domain in which you have any expertise, any human expertise, because nothing can really substitute for the instincts and the sort of sublingual techniques that we use to confront problems, because we are dynamic systems. We are constantly, you have to feed something like ChatGPT or any sort of large language model or any sort of supposed neural network or computerized model. You have to feed it on a regular basis. There's simply not enough routes inward. There's not enough energy, or at least not an efficient way in which to continually feed it information that's useful and then get that information back in a useful form, even omitting like any sort of scurrilous hacking or anything like that. Like we are a much more efficient model because like we are experiencing reality directly, and also B, because we have purpose. It's sort of, and this
All
is
of which,
what I want
all
to.
of
Yeah,
which, Mark,
let's wrap things up.
all of which is probably true. I just think
Yeah.
that the engineers should be allowed to figure that out for themselves without the school of arms interposing themselves. And
Oh, absolutely. Look, that's all the stuff I agree with. Absolutely. So just to close things out, before we do that, I wanted to revisit this idea of purpose, because that's the key thing that's missing here. It precedes anything that we do. And so in whether we view this as a waste of time or a super weapon or the ring of power, I think ultimately the more important question, before we even get into tactics, before we even get into the territory that he's describing, and it even precedes the conversation about safetyism, which we all agree is a massive problem, right? It's a problem because not because, again, to be clear, not because it strips us of agency, but because it continues us along a path where our options become very limited in what we can do at any given moment, because somebody, as Grant said, like somebody will come and ultimately kill us if we divert from that path, even if it's supposedly exists to protect us from ourselves. You don't wear the helmet, then eventually you're in jail or you're dead on the street corner. That still requires like a purpose that precedes any kind of action that we're going to take. And that's whether we're armed with a spear, whether we're armed with a rocket launcher, whether we're armed with a drone swarm connected via some kind of science fiction, Elon Musk brain implant. No matter what, we need to first evaluate what our purpose is, and I think that if we look at that closely enough, if we really, really think about it, we're not going to arrive at the conclusion that of some sort of will to power, ubermensch reality. I think we might come back around to the reality that we are explorers of the unknown, and so all of those unknowable things. I think that would be, at least potentially, the highest goal, is to say, here is all the unknowns. Let me try to know them as best as I can and relate them to other agents so that they may take that ball and know even more. And hopefully, at the very least, that's the plan of God.